December 2nd, 1967. The sky over Hanoi is a graveyard of burning titanium. High above the clouds, a formation of American F-4 Phantoms, the undisputed kings of the sky, are hunting. These are not just airplanes. They are $2.5 million marvels of Cold War engineering. Each one is equipped with cutting-edge pulse Doppler radar, capable of tracking targets miles away. They carry 6 air-to-air missiles, designed to kill before the enemy even knows they're being watched. The pilots? The best the United States Navy and Air Force have to offer. Against them stands a relic, a Soviet-made MiG-21. It costs 1/8 the price of a Phantom. Its radar is primitive. It carries only 2 missiles. Its cockpit is cramped, lacking the sophisticated computers of its American rivals. On paper, this isn't a fight. It's an execution. But on this day, and for the next 2 years, the execution would go the other way. American pilots are being plucked from the sky by tactics the Pentagon cannot comprehend. Hit-and-run ambushes from below, ghost-like disappearances into the clouds. And at the epicenter of this aerial guerrilla warfare is one man. He isn't a career military aristocrat. He's a 23-year-old son of a rice farmer. His name is Nguyen Van Coc. By the time the smoke clears in 1969, this underdog will have shot down 9 American aircraft, becoming the most successful fighter ace of the entire Vietnam War. He didn't just win dogfights, he shattered the American illusion of technological invincibility. How did a pilot in an outdated jet defeat the most powerful air force in human history? What fatal flaw did the Americans leave wide open in their $2 million machines? And how did the lessons learned from being humiliated by a rice farmer's son lead to the birth of the legendary Top Gun school? Today, we go inside the cockpit of Red 3107 to uncover the science of the Bison tactics and the man who turned the Hanoi sky into a no-fly zone for the world's only superpower. To understand how Nguyen Van Coc broke the Pentagon's playbook, you first have to understand where he came from. In 1944, when Coc was born in Nam Dinh province, the sky over Vietnam didn't belong to the Vietnamese. It belonged to the Japanese, then the French. For a boy whose father spent every day knee-deep in the mud of a rice paddy, an airplane wasn't a weapon. It was a miracle. It was something gods flew, not farmers. But the 1960s changed everything. North Vietnam was building an air force from scratch. They didn't have a century of aviation tradition like the Americans. They had a desperate need and a handful of young men who weren't afraid to die. The selection process was brutal. Imagine 500 of the brightest young minds in the country being poked, prodded, and tested. By the end, only 30 remained. Nguyen Van Coc was one of them. Not because he was a natural-born killer, but because he had a singular, obsessive focus. He wanted to fly. In 1964, Coc was shipped off to a place that felt like another planet, Krasnodar in the Soviet Union. This is where the transformation began. The Soviets didn't just teach them how to fly, they taught them how to survive. Their teacher was the MiG-21, NATO codename Fishbed. If the American F-4 Phantom was a heavy, muscular Cadillac with a rocket engine, the MiG-21 was a silver scalpel. It was tiny. It was light. It was essentially a massive Tumansky R-11 turbojet engine with a cockpit and 2 stubby delta wings attached to it. Inside that cockpit, there was no luxury. It smelled of kerosene and sweat. It was cramped, so small that tall Western pilots could barely fit inside. There were no multifunction displays or digital computers, just rows of analog dials and a primitive radar that could barely see past its own nose. But the MiG-21 had one thing the F-4 didn't: agility. It could turn on a dime. It could accelerate vertically like a flare. It was the perfect weapon for a man who knew he couldn't win a fair fight. The Soviet instructors were clear. You cannot duel with the Americans. They have better eyes. They have more missiles. If you stay in a dogfight for more than 2 minutes, you are a dead man. This birthed the Bison doctrine. The North Vietnamese pilots were trained to be the extension of the ground radar. They wouldn't make their own decisions. They would be guided like human-controlled missiles by a central command post in Hanoi. Nguyen Van Coc returned to Vietnam in 1965 with only 120 hours of flight time. To put that in perspective, the American top guns he was about to face had over 500, some over 1,000. On paper, Coc was a novice. But he had a secret weapon, a tactic that exploited the one thing the Americans thought they didn't need anymore. The Americans had forgotten how to fight close up, and Nguyen Van Coc was about to remind them, one fireball at a time. In the early 1960s, the Pentagon was convinced of one thing. The era of the dogfight was dead. They believed that modern air combat would be fought with buttons and screens, not stick and rudder. The F-4 Phantom II was the manifestation of this arrogance. At $2.4 million per aircraft, roughly $23 million in today's money, it was a beast. It could carry 18,000 pounds of munitions. It could fly at Mach 2.2. It was so powerful that pilots used to joke that even a brick can fly if you put 2 big enough engines on it. But the F-4 had a glaring, almost unbelievable omission. It had no gun, no cannon, nothing. American engineers believed that long-range missiles had rendered close-quarters combat obsolete. Why build a gun that shoots 500 meters when you have an AIM-7 Sparrow missile that can kill from 45 kilometers? The logic was perfect in a laboratory. It was a disaster over the jungles of Vietnam. The reality? The primary weapon of the F-4, the AIM-7 Sparrow, was a nightmare of early electronics. In the humid, vibrating environment of a fighter jet, the vacuum tubes and delicate circuits failed constantly. According to declassified U.S. Air Force studies, during the early years of the war, the AIM-7 had a hit probability of less than 10%. 10%. Imagine spending $23 million on a jet only for your primary weapon to fail 9 out of 10 times. Then there was the radar. The APQ-72 radar was revolutionary, but it had an Achilles heel: ground clutter. If an enemy plane flew low, near the trees, the radar signal would hit the ground and scatter, creating a blind spot on the American screens. The F-4 was looking for targets in the high, clear blue sky. It was completely blind to what was happening in the green shadows below. This is exactly where the North Vietnamese, led by pilots like Nguyen Van Coc, were waiting. They knew the Americans couldn't see them if they stayed low. They knew the American missiles couldn't track them if they turned sharply. And they knew that once they got close, inside that 500-meter range, the mighty F-4 Phantom was effectively unarmed. It was like a heavyweight boxer with a 7-foot reach, being attacked by a man with a knife in a telephone booth. The Americans called it the missile gap. The Vietnamese called it opportunity. But knowing a flaw exists is one thing. Exploiting it with a 23-year-old pilot who had never seen a real dogfight is another. To turn these technical flaws into flaming wreckage, the North Vietnamese had to build something else: the Bison network. While American pilots relied on the multi-million-dollar radars inside their cockpits, the North Vietnamese relied on something far more distributed and far more difficult to destroy. They called it Bison. Bison wasn't a plane. It was a massive, nationwide network of Soviet-built early warning radar stations, hidden deep in the jungles and caves of North Vietnam. This was the central nervous system of the air war. In the West, we think of a fighter pilot as a lone wolf, a maverick making split-second decisions. But in the North Vietnamese Air Force, a pilot like Nguyen Van Coc was an extension of the ground controller's will. The strategy was guerrilla air warfare. It followed a terrifyingly efficient four-step process. Step 1, the shadow launch. As soon as American strike packages, often 40 to 60 aircraft strong, crossed from Thailand or the Gulf of Tonkin, Bison saw them. But they didn't scramble dozens of MiGs to meet them head-on. That would be suicide. Instead, they launched 2, maybe 4 MiG-21s from hidden airfields. Step 2, going dark. The MiGs would immediately dive to an altitude of less than 500 meters, 1,640 feet. They turned off their own radars. They stayed radio silent. To the American F-4s flying high above, the MiGs simply didn't exist. They were ghosts, hidden by the ground clutter we talked about earlier. Step 3, the vector. Inside the Bison bunker, controllers watched the American formation's blind spots. They would whisper coordinates to the pilots. Bearing 045, distance 20 kilometers. Target is above you. The pilot didn't look at his radar. He looked at his fuel gauge and waited for the command. Step 4, the vertical pop-up. This was the masterpiece. Guided by Bison, the MiGs would maneuver directly behind and below the American formation. Then, the order came. Afterburners on. Climb. The MiG-21 would scream upward at over 200 meters per second, 656 feet. By the time it broke through the clouds, it was already within 2 kilometers of the F-4's tail. At this range, the American pilot had no warning, no radar lock-on tone, nothing. Just the sudden sight of a white smoke trail in his rearview mirror. The MiG would fire, and before the debris of the F-4 even hit the jungle floor, the MiG was already diving back into the clouds, heading for home. Total engagement time? Under 90 seconds. It was a perfect trap. But the Pentagon wasn't about to let a rice farmer's son keep humiliating them. They realized they were being lured into a scripted game. And in early 1967, a legendary American colonel named Robin Olds decided it was time to rewrite the script. The hunter was about to become the bait. By early 1967, the U.S. Air Force was bleeding. The MiG-21s, guided by the Bison network, were treating American formations like an all-you-can-eat buffet. The Americans would send fighter sweeps, pure F-4 formations, to hunt MiGs, but the MiGs simply wouldn't show up. The Bison controllers knew that fighting an F-4 in a fair fight was a losing game. They only ordered the MiGs to scramble when the slow, heavily laden F-105 Thunderchief bombers arrived. Colonel Robin Olds, a legendary World War II ace, saw the pattern. He realized the Vietnamese weren't just fighting with jets, they were fighting with information. To beat them, he had to lie to their radar. He called it Operation Bolo. The plan was a masterclass in deception, a digital Trojan horse designed to lure the MiGs into a kill zone. Olds ordered his F-4 Phantoms to do the unthinkable, act like prey. To achieve this, every F-4 in the strike package was outfitted with Quad-Tor C160 jamming pods. These devices emitted a specific electronic signature that was the unmistakable fingerprint of the F-105 bombers. On a radar screen deep in a Hanoi bunker, these deadly fighters would appear as nothing more than slow-moving, vulnerable targets. But the disguise went deeper than just electronics. The pilots were ordered to fly the exact same routes, at the same altitudes, and at the same sluggish speeds as a standard bombing run. They even filled the radio waves with the specific call signs of the bomber wings, mimicking the chatter of a routine mission to ensure the illusion was perfect. To the Bison controllers, it looked like just another day of easy kills. Bison bit the bait. Hard. Thinking they were about to intercept a group of helpless bombers, 16 MiG-21s, Nearly half of North Vietnam's entire fleet scrambled into the air. Among them were the best pilots the North had. They climbed through the thick cloud layer, expecting to see the bulky bellies of F-105s. Instead, they broke through the clouds and saw the terrifying twin-engine silhouettes of 28 F-4 Phantoms, led by Robin Olds himself. The ambushers had been ambushed. In just 12 minutes of chaotic, high-G combat, the sky turned into a slaughterhouse. Robin Olds personally chased down a MiG, firing a sidewinder that blew the tail clean off. His wingmen followed suit. By the time the remaining MiGs dived back into the safety of the clouds, 7 MiG-21s had been destroyed. The U.S. lost 0. It was the most successful air-to-air engagement of the war. The Pentagon declared the MiG threat neutralized. They thought they had finally broken the back of the North Vietnamese Air Force. But there was one problem with their celebration. Nguyen Van Coc wasn't in that fight. He had been scheduled to fly, his jet fueled and armed. But minutes before takeoff, ground control shifted his sector. Some say it was luck. Some say the Bison controllers sensed the American formation was too perfect, too coordinated, and held their best ace back. The Pentagon thought they had won the war, but all they had done was teach the son of a rice farmer a very expensive lesson. And when Nguyen Van Coc returned to the sky 3 months later, he wouldn't be looking for a fair fight. He would be looking for blood. For 3 months after Operation Bolo, the North Vietnamese skies were eerily quiet. The 921st Fighter Regiment had been grounded, humiliated, and forced to reevaluate everything. The Pentagon's analysts were patting themselves on the back, convinced they had turned the MiG-21 into an endangered species. But silence isn't always surrender. Sometimes, it's just the sound of a predator holding its breath. April 30th, 1967, 2:14 p.m. The silence at Gia Lam Airfield is shattered by an alarm that sounds different this time. It's not just a warning, it's an invitation. A massive American strike package is inbound. This time, Nguyen Van Coc isn't the wingman watching from the sidelines. He is the shooter. He is the tip of the spear. Guided by the Bison controllers who have now learned to spot the American deceptions, Coc's flight of 4 MiGs stays low, skimming the jagged limestone karsts of North Vietnam. They are invisible to the F-4's radar, which is still searching the high blue for targets. Then comes the command: target 20 kilometers, climb. Coc breaks through the cloud deck at 18,000 feet. Ahead of him, 4 F-4 Phantoms are cruising in a loose formation. They have no idea he is there. Coc doesn't hesitate. He doesn't look for a prolonged dogfight. He follows the 60-second rule. He locks his infrared seeker onto the heat of the second Phantom's engine. A high-pitched growl fills his headset. Fire. Visual. The K-13 Atoll missile streaks forward. A direct hit. The F-4 disintegrates into a ball of orange flame and black smoke. Coc doesn't stay to watch the debris fall. He doesn't look for a second kill. Before the American wingmen can even roll their aircraft to find the threat, Coc has already cut his throttle and dived back into the clouds. Total time exposed: 12 seconds. That night, for the first time, Radio Hanoi broadcasts his name. The son of a rice farmer had just claimed his first official victory, but he was just getting started. Between April and December 1967, Nguyen Van Coc became a ghost that haunted the U.S. Air Force. In October, he claimed an F-4D. 5 days later, an F-105 Thunderchief. By November 18th, he did the unthinkable. He shot down 2 American aircraft in a single mission, achieving ace status in record time. The Pentagon began to notice a pattern. Every time a specific MiG-21 with the tail number 3107 appeared, American jets fell from the sky. U.S. intelligence began tracking him as a priority target. Pilots were briefed in the ready rooms. If you see a silver MiG popping out of the clouds at 6 o'clock, don't fight. Break and run. By the end of 1967, Nguyen Van Coc had 9 confirmed kills. He was a double ace, the most successful fighter pilot of the entire war on either side. He had done it in a jet that was considered obsolete against an enemy with infinite resources. But as Coc's legend grew, the war was changing. The Americans were tired of being humiliated. They realized that their technology wasn't the problem. Their training was. And the final legacy of Nguyen Van Coc wouldn't just be the planes he shot down, but the radical way he forced the US Navy to reinvent the way pilots fought. The farmer's son was about to inadvertently help create the most famous flight school in the world. By 1968, the statistics coming out of Southeast Asia were a gut punch to the American military establishment. In World War II, the air-to-air kill ratio was 10-1. In Korea, it was still a respectable 7-1. But in the skies over North Vietnam, against a primitive air force, and pilots like Nguyen Van Coc, that ratio had collapsed to an embarrassing 2-1. For every 2 MiGs shot down, the United States was losing one of its multi-million-dollar Phantoms. To the Pentagon, this wasn't just a tactical failure. It was a mathematical impossibility. The machine had failed. The missile age was a lie. In 1968, Captain Frank Ault was commissioned to find out why. His conclusion was a slap in the face to every defense contractor in America. The problem wasn't the radar, it wasn't the missiles. The problem was that American pilots had forgotten how to fly. They had become system operators instead of warriors. They were so reliant on their technology that they had lost the art of the dogfight, the very art that Nguyen Van Coc had mastered in the mud and the clouds. The response was radical. In 1969, the US Navy established the Fighter Weapons School, better known today as Top Gun. The curriculum was simple. Go back to basics. Learn to fight at close range. And most importantly, learn to fight against the MiG-21. They created aggressor squadrons, American pilots flying small, nimble aircraft like the A-4 Skyhawk to mimic the flight characteristics of the fish bed. Every maneuver taught at Top Gun was a direct response to the Bison tactics. Every simulated dogfight was a ghost hunt for pilots, like Red 3107. And what of the man who forced the greatest superpower on Earth to go back to school? Nguyen Van Coc didn't die in a fireball over Hanoi. He survived. In 1969, with 9 confirmed kills and his name etched into aviation history, the North Vietnamese government made a strategic decision. He was too valuable to lose. They pulled him from the front lines and turned him into a teacher. He spent the rest of the war training the next generation of Vietnamese aces, passing down the secrets of the vertical climb, the radar blind spot, and the 60-second kill. COC stayed in the military for decades, eventually retiring in 2002 as the Chief Inspector of the Ministry of Defense, holding the rank of Lieutenant General. If you meet him today, he doesn't look like a slayer of phantoms. He looks like what he always was, a son of a rice farmer. He speaks of his enemies not with hatred, but with the professional respect of one hunter for another. The story of Nguyen Van Coc is a reminder that in the age of AI, stealth technology, and billion-dollar sensors, the most powerful weapon in the sky is still the human being in the cockpit. Technology can fail. Radars can be jammed. But the intuition of a man who knows his environment and his enemy is invincible. The Americans won the tech race. But for a few bloody years in the 1960s, a farmer's son from Nam Dinh owned the sky. If you want to see more deep dives into the secret history of aviation, hit the subscribe button. And let us know in the comments, do you think modern stealth tech has finally made the dogfight obsolete? Or is there another Nguyen Van Coc waiting in the clouds?